A simple woman just stepped into a luxury hotel after a long day helping families in need. But instead of welcome, she's humiliated and forced to leave. Minutes later, when her husband walks in, everything changes. Stay with me to witness a lesson that shook an entire room and showed everyone the true measure of respect. Before we dive into the story, comment below and let us know, where in the world are you watching from? And if you believe that dignity should never depend on appearances. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that matter. Now, it was just an ordinary afternoon at the Grand Meridian. The afternoon sun spilled a golden haze over the Grand Meridian's ornate iron gates, casting long shadows across the flawless marble entryway. The building itself was a monument to grandeur, gleaming chandeliers the size of small cars, floors so polished they mirrored the heels of the elite, and a constant soft hum of wealth moving quietly through the air. Marianne Lawrence stood for a moment outside the massive revolving doors, adjusting the strap of her canvas tote bag against her shoulder. She wore no makeup, no jewelry. Her clothes were simple, a gray sweatshirt, a pair of worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. She pushed her baseball cap higher on her forehead, brushing a few strands of pale blonde hair from her face, and took a steadying breath. Inside her tote bag were pamphlets and leftover donation lists from the community center, where she had just spent 10 hours sorting food packages, arranging rides for elderly families, and washing countless dishes. She hadn't even thought about changing before rushing to meet Franklin. Here there simply hadn't been time. The tiredness clung to her bones, but beneath it was a calm sense of purpose. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was simply here to meet her husband. The doorman didn't smile as she passed. Instead, his eyes flicked over her clothes, then away, dismissive. She stepped into the grand lobby, where the difference between herself and everyone else felt almost physical, like a wall she had to push through. Guests lounged in designer cocktail dresses, silk scarves tossed casually over bronze shoulders, cufflinks catching the chandelier light. Staff in impeccable uniforms glided between them with practiced efficiency, offering champagne flutes and murmured courtesies. Above the main desk, an elegant, scripted sign proclaimed, "The Grand Meridian welcomes you." But the glances slicing toward her suggested otherwise. A young woman behind the concierge desk looked up, caught Marianne's eye, and immediately dropped her gaze to whisper urgently to her colleague. Marianne pretended not to notice. Instead, she kept her head high, crossing the pristine lobby toward the desk. "I'm here to meet my husband," she said, her voice clear, offering a polite smile. "He should be arriving shortly for the Global Reform Conference." The concierge's smile remained frozen in place, but her eyes flickered first to Marianne's baseball cap, then her worn jeans, then the scuffed sneakers. "And your husband's name would be, she asked, with the faintest trace of disbelief. Before Marianne could reply, a new voice cut sharply through the muted hum of conversations. "Excuse me." Polite on the surface, but heavy with something underneath. Marianne turned to face a man in his late 40s, his silver-streaked hair styled immaculately, his navy suit so precisely tailored it looked sewn onto him. His name tag, gleaming and aggressive, announced him Elliot Winchester, hotel manager. "May I help you?" he said, a tight professional smile curving his lips. But his pale eyes were already scanning her, not out of concern, but calculation. "I'm just waiting for my husband," Marianne explained, her voice as even as she could make it. "I see," Elliot interrupted smoothly, with just the slightest lift of an eyebrow. "And does your husband, have a reservation with us?" The emphasis wasn't subtle. Marianne felt the slow warmth of humiliation rise to her cheeks. She had encountered this tone before, the insinuation that someone like her couldn't possibly belong here unless, perhaps, she was cleaning the place. "Yes," she said simply. Elliot's smile thinned. "Perhaps," he suggested in a voice dripping with carefully disguised disdain, "I could assist you in finding a more appropriate place to wait." Marianne strained, feeling the weight of a dozen invisible judgments pressing against her. "I'm perfectly comfortable here," she replied. Her words clipped, her chin lifting fractionally. Elliot's posture stiffened. His gaze flicked around the lobby at the beautiful people, at the luxury, at the shining perfection of everything that mattered to him. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "Ma'am," he said, "the Grand Meridian has certain standards we must maintain. We're hosting very distinguished guests today. Perhaps you don't realize the nature of our establishment." Oh, she realized. She realized more than he could ever guess. Marianne felt the old anger stir in her chest, the quiet, grinding anger of 1,000 small humiliations born over years spent beside Franklin on the public stage, fighting for causes bigger than themselves. She recognized the polished cruelty in Elliot Winchester just as surely as she recognized the polished marble under her feet. "I'm well aware," she said quietly. A well-dressed couple nearby slowed their conversation to listen, then quickly turned away, pretending disinterest. A security guard shifted slightly closer, uncertain. Then, Elliot continued, his patience visibly thinning. "You'll understand why I must insist. There's a lovely cafe just across the street. You might find it more, welcoming." Marianne felt the flush creep up her neck, but she did not lower her gaze. "My husband specifically asked me to meet him here," she said, every word measured and steady. Elliot sighed dramatically, as if her existence was a burden he could barely endure. "Look," he said, glancing around to make sure no important guests were watching too closely. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this isn't going to work. We have security protocols, especially today." "I'm not pulling anything," Marianne said, keeping her voice level. "Nevertheless, I must insist," he said, his voice rising just slightly above the murmur of the lobby. "Either provide proof you're a guest or leave the premises." Now, more faces turned toward them openly. Staff members began to hover behind the desk. Whispering, a young employee looked down at his shoes, clearly uncomfortable. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes stepped forward, hesitated, then stopped when Elliot shot her a look of warning. "Mr. Winchester," Marianne began, fighting to keep her composure. "I understand you're doing your job." "No, I don't think you do understand," he snapped, the civility dropping from his voice like a mask slipping. He gestured sharply toward her sweatshirt. "This is the Grand Meridian. We maintain certain standards of appearance and conduct." Marianne stared at him, the exhaustion of her long day crashing over her like a wave. She wasn't embarrassed anymore. She was furious. She had spent the last 10 hours serving people who could barely afford groceries. And now, for the crime of dressing impractically, she was being treated like garbage. "Are you seriously judging me because of my clothes?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly with controlled rage. "I'm enforcing our policies," he said stiffly. "This isn't a public park. This is a 5-star establishment." He tugged at the cuffs of his pristine shirt, as if her very presence contaminated him. Marianne clenched her hands into fists at her sides. She could end this. Right now, she could say her husband's name. She could watch the color drain from Elliot's face. But something inside her refused. Let him make the mistake, she thought. Let him show exactly who he was. Fine. Elliot seemed to decide. He reached for the radio clipped to his belt. "Security to the main lobby, please," he said crisply. A security guard, a young man with a nervous expression, appeared within seconds. Elliot pointed at Marianne. "Please escort this person from the premises." The guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, are you sure?" "Now," Elliot barked. Marianne drew herself up, feeling the burn of countless eyes on her. She wasn't angry for herself. She was angry for every person who had ever been treated as invisible, as unworthy, simply because they didn't look the part. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low but ringing with certainty. Elliot gave a thin, patronizing smile. "The mistake was yours. thinking you could just walk in here like this. The security guard stepped forward, his hand hesitating near her arm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice almost apologetic, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Marianne stared straight ahead, refusing to flinch. She would walk out with dignity. She decided she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her humiliated. And just as she took her first step toward the door, the great glass doors of the Grand Meridian swung open with a soft, majestic sigh. The air in the lobby changed, snapped like the first moment before a thunderstorm breaks. A man stood framed in the entrance, and everything stopped. The moment Franklin Lawrence appeared in the doorway of the Grand Meridian, it was as if the very air inside the lobby contracted and held its breath. His frame, tall and commanding, was cut sharply against the sun's dying light. Even those who did not recognize his face instantly understood they were in the presence of someone important. His tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, but it wasn't the clothing that demanded attention. It was the certainty in his step, the deep stillness in his gaze as he scanned the room. His eyes found her almost immediately. Marianne standing stiff and straight near the concierge desk, a security guard hovering uncertainly at her side. Elliot Winchester a step behind with a self-satisfied smirk still tugging at his mouth. Oblivious to the shift that had just shattered the shallow composure of the room, Franklin's pace did not quicken, but each stride seemed to reverberate through the polished marble floor like a drum beat. Guests began to murmur, subtle at first, then louder as recognition spread from face to face like a spark catching dry leaves. Some guests stood straighter, tugging nervously at the hems of their designer sleeves. Staff members who had moments ago turned a blind eye now found urgent excuses to be elsewhere. Bustling toward invisible tasks, Marianne watched her husband approach, the tightness in her chest loosening just slightly. His face, usually so warm and open, was now a mask of restrained concern. He reached her in 3 steady strides, stopping so close she could feel the steady presence of him like a shield between her and the scorn of the room. "Marianne," Franklin said, his voice low but resonant, carrying easily across the hush that had fallen. Relief, fierce and unexpected, washed over her, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze evenly, her hands clutching the worn canvas strap of her bag. "I'm fine," she said, though the tremor beneath her words betrayed the strain of the last few minutes. Franklin's eyes flickered past her, taking in the security guard, the way Elliot still stood half a pace behind as if ready to intervene. His expression hardened imperceptibly, a shift only those who knew him well would recognize. Before he could speak again, a man with thinning hair and a deep maroon tie bustled toward them, face flushed with a mixture of excitement and panic. "Mr. Lawrence, welcome to the Grand Meridian," he exclaimed, thrusting out a hand. "We are truly honored to have you and Mrs. Lawrence with us this evening." Franklin ignored the outstretched hand. His focus remained entirely on Marianne, his hand moving to lightly touch her elbow, steadying her without word. "What happened here?" Franklin asked, not raising his voice but making it clear that he would have an answer. The manager, whose name tag read Marcus Bennett, blanched slightly. His gaze darted toward Elliot, whose once confident posture had begun to wilt visibly. "Your wife was just, well, there seems to have been a misunderstanding," Elliot said quickly, stepping forward, his voice suddenly brittle. "A small matter of verifying guest credentials, you understand. Mr. Lawrence? Security protocols, with the conference and all." Marianne remained silent, letting the ridiculousness of the excuse hang in the space between them. She could feel the heat of a dozen eyes on her back, every witness waiting to see how the next moment would unfold. Franklin's eyes narrowed slightly. His next words were deliberate, each one sliding into place like steel doors locking. "A misunderstanding," he repeated softly. Elliot nodded vigorously, color rising in splotchy patches up his neck. "Yes, sir. Of course, naturally. Had we known..." Franklin cut him off with a slight lift of his hand, the gesture economical, devastating. "If you had known she was my wife, you would have treated her differently?" he asked. The question was simple, but it left Elliot floundering, mouth opening and closing like a fish stranded on dry land. He looked toward Marcus, seeking rescue, but none came. The older woman Marianne had noticed her earlier, the one with kind eyes who had tried, tentatively, to intervene, stepped forward now with a courage that seemed to swell in the heavy silence. "Mr. Lawrence," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "Mrs. Davis." "Sir." I recognized Mrs. Lawrence immediately. I tried to inform Mr. Winchester, but he refused to listen. Franklin nodded once, acknowledging her without breaking his gaze from Elliot. For a long moment, no one spoke. The lobby was a theater, frozen mid-scene guests pretending to check their phones but staring over the edges. Staff members rooted to their spots. Finally, Franklin spoke again, voice low and calm. "The Grand Meridian prides itself on its standards," he said, as if quoting Elliot's earlier words. "Tell me, Mr. Winchester, what standards are those?" "Exactly." "Yay." Elliot swallowed hard, the sound almost audible. We aim to maintain a certain level of decorum," he stammered. "For the comfort of our guest." Franklin's eyes sharpened, catching the lie and pinning it to the wall. "And decorum, in your definition, excludes compassion, respect, common decency." "No, sir, of course not." "Then explain to me," Franklin continued, relentless but never raising his voice, "how you justified attempting to have my wife removed for wearing comfortable clothes after a day spent helping families less fortunate than any of us." A ripple of embarrassment passed through the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others turned red. As if their complicity had been exposed by proxy, Elliot opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Marcus Bennett cleared his throat loudly, stepping in before the situation could deteriorate further. "Mr. Winchester's actions were entirely inappropriate and do not reflect the values of the Grand Meridian," he said hurriedly. "I assure you, disciplinary action will be taken." Franklin inclined his head slightly. "Good." He turned to Marianne then, offering his arm. "Shall we?" Marianne hesitated just a heartbeat. She could walk away, now rise above it. Leave Elliot to stew in the wreckage of his own prejudice. It would be the gracious thing to do. But as she looked at Elliot's crumbling composure, something inside her shifted, a stubborn flicker of belief that people, even the ones who least deserved it, could change if given the right mirror. She rested her hand lightly on Franklin's arm and addressed Marcus directly. "I don't want him fired," she said. There was a murmur of surprise, sharp enough to cut through the charged air. Franklin glanced down at her, eyebrows lifting slightly, but he said nothing. Marcus looked momentarily confused. "Mrs. Lawrence, with all due respect, after what you've endured." Marianne shook her head gently. "Firing him would be easy. It would also be useless. He would take his anger somewhere else, punish someone else, and nothing would change." Elliot stared at her, the first genuine emotion confusion, shame, something raw and real flickering across his face. Marianne held his gaze. "You don't fix prejudice by shuffling it into another building," she said. "You fix it by confronting it, living through it, learning." The words hung in the silence like a new kind of judgment, not of punishment, but of possibility. Marcus cleared his throat again, less certain now. "What, would you suggest?" Marianne smiled faintly, the steel beneath it unmistakable. "I suggest," she said, "that Mr. Winchester spend the next month working where he can see firsthand the people he so easily dismissed today." Her voice was not loud, but it was unshakable. "At the community center where I volunteer." Elliot's mouth opened in shock. "You'll learn a lot," Marianne added quietly. "Yeah. And when the month is over, if you still think appearances matter more than heart, then maybe you never belonged here in the first place." Franklin said nothing. He didn't have to. His eyes glowed with silent pride. Marianne turned without waiting for a response, her husband matching her stride, his hand once again resting lightly at her back. They walked together toward the elevator, heads high, leaving behind a lobby filled with stunned silence, whispering voices, and a single man, Elliot Winchester, standing in the ruins of his certainty, the first fragile cracks of understanding breaking open inside him, and somewhere, deep in his gut, Elliot knew the lesson was just beginning. Elliot Winchester sat alone in a small, cramped office tucked away in the service corridors behind the Grand Meridian's gleaming facade. The hum of the hotel lobby, once a comforting backdrop to his meticulously ordered world, was now muffled by the thick walls and heavy door. His tie lay loose around his neck, his jacket draped carelessly over the back of a chair. In front of him, a letter of suspension sat stark against the polished wood of the desk, its crisp corporate language an indictment written in sterile black ink. For the first time in years, Elliot did not know what to do. 20 years he had clawed his way up the ruthless ladder of luxury hospitality. He had memorized the rules of appearances, mastered the dance of power and deference, built a career on knowing precisely who mattered and who did not. And in a single afternoon, he had watched that carefully curated world crumble beneath his feet. He buried his face in his hands. The knock at the door was so soft he almost missed it. "Go away," he muttered. Not lifting his head, the door creaked open anyway. Mrs. Davis stepped inside, her figure silhouetted against the sterile fluorescent lights of the hallway. She did not gloat. She did not smirk or shake her head in the satisfaction he would have expected, perhaps even preferred. Instead, she crossed the room with slow, measured steps and placed a small, styrofoam cup of coffee in front of him. Elliot stared at it, baffled. "I thought you might need something warm," she said quietly. He laughed bitterly, the sound scraping painfully from his throat. "Kindness now, after the mess I've made." Mrs. Davis's eyes, kind and tired, met his. "You still have a chance," she said simply. He scoffed. "To do what? Apologize? It won't change what happened. It won't change how I looked at her." "No," she agreed. "It won't. But what you do next might." She let that hang in the air a moment longer before turning and leaving him alone once more. Elliot stared at the door long after it closed, the cup of coffee cooling untouched on the desk. The next morning, he stood awkwardly outside the battered brick building that housed the Jefferson Community Center, clutching a clipboard and feeling more lost than he had in his entire life. The center was a far cry from the Grand Meridian. The walls were patched and peeling, the windows streaked with the grime of too many seasons and too little budget. A faded banner fluttered limply over the entrance, serving with dignity and hope. Inside, the smell of industrial disinfectant barely masked the deeper sense of cooking food, damp clothing, and humanity itself. Marianne Lawrence was waiting for him just inside the door, wearing a simple navy sweater and khakis, no designer labels, no jewelry, just her as she had been that day in the lobby. "You're early," she said, without warmth or hostility, just observation. Elliot shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't want to be late." Marianne handed him a name tag and a volunteer's schedule without comment. "Today," she said, "you're on meal prep. Kitchen's that way." She pointed down a hallway that seemed far too narrow, its walls covered in children's crayon drawings and posters about flu shots and after-school programs. He nodded stiffly and headed toward the kitchen, acutely aware of how out of place he felt. The kitchen was a storm of activity. Steam billowed from ancient industrial pots. Volunteers bustled between battered counters and squeaky ovens, and voices rose and fell in a messy, discordant symphony of need and service. A wiry man in a faded Red Sox cap waved him over. "You, Winchester?" he barked. Elliot blinked. "Yes, sir." "Good. Gloves are over there. You're on vegetable duty." Within minutes, Elliot found himself elbow-deep in a mound of carrots and onions, the acrid sting of raw onions biting at his eyes. He tried to find a rhythm, to impose some kind of order on the chaotic environment, but nothing went smoothly. His peeler kept jamming, his cuts were uneven, He dropped a colander full of diced celery onto the floor and had to clean it up while other volunteers sidestepped him with a mix of sympathy and impatience. By the third hour, sweat darkened the back of his shirt. His hands ached. His back throbbed. No one in the Grand Meridian had ever treated him like he was invisible. Here, he wasn't even important enough to scold. During a brief break, he found himself standing by the loading dock, gulping cool air, trying to process the reality of this strange new world. Marianne appeared beside him, sipping from a battered travel mug. "Harder than it looks, isn't it?" she said, almost conversationally. Elliot grimaced, too exhausted to summon pride. "Much." She watched him for a long moment, then said, "Every tray you prepped today will feed someone who hasn't had a hot meal in days. Remember that." He nodded mutely, feeling a lump rise in his throat, not from exhaustion, but something harder to admit: shame. Over the next days, Elliot settled into a strange, punishing routine. Mornings began at dawn, unloading trucks of donated food that often arrived bruised, broken, or barely salvageable. Afternoons were spent portioning meals, scrubbing industrial-sized pots, or sorting clothing donations. Evenings sometimes stretched into night if a storm rolled in or an emergency shelter opened. No one treated him like he was special. No one cared that he had once managed five-star service for the wealthy elite. Here, a clean tray of hot food mattered more than a perfectly set table. A dry blanket mattered more than a crisp linen napkin. A smile, a kind word, a simple act of service, they carried more weight here than all the gold keys and polished shoes in the world. It was humbling in a way Elliot had never experienced. It was brutal. It was necessary. He learned names. He learned stories. There was Miguel, the young man who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford rent. Mrs. Chapman, an elderly woman whose pension barely stretched to cover her medications. Little Jordan, a wide-eyed boy who clung to a battered teddy bear and never smiled unless you knelt down to his level. Each face, each name, chipped away at the wall Elliot had built inside himself over decades, the wall that had once allowed him to see people not as individuals, but as problems to be managed, impressions to be curated. One evening, after serving over 200 dinners and helping mop the floor afterward, Elliot found himself sitting alone at one of the folding tables, absently tracing the grooves carved into the cheap plastic surface. Marianne sat down across from him, sliding a bottle of water his way. "You're different," she said without preamble. He looked up, startled. "You're seeing them now," she continued. "Not just their clothes, not just what they can do for you. You see them." Elliot swallowed hard, unable to find words. Marianne smiled a real smile, warm and unguarded. "It's the first step," she said. "Seeing, really seeing." He nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning not just in his mind, but deeper in the raw, aching spaces he hadn't known existed before. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ragged skyline of the city, painting the sky in bruised colors. Tomorrow would come with more meals to serve, more loads to carry, more lessons to learn. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Elliot Winchester found he was grateful for the work ahead, because maybe, just maybe, he was starting to become the man he had always thought he already was. The rain came down hard the following Tuesday, turning the cracked sidewalks around Jefferson Community Center into narrow rivers of murky brown water. Elliot Winchester stood under the leaky awning outside the main entrance, clutching a clipboard that was already soaked through, watching as the battered old delivery truck struggled to back into position. The wind lashed at his face, cold and insistent, but he made no move to step back inside. He had promised Miguel he would take the delivery. Miguel, who normally handled the trucks, had called that morning in a hoarse whisper, explaining he couldn't make it. His mother was sick again, and the hospital bill this time might be the one that broke them for good. So Elliot stood there, feeling the rain soak through his second-hand jacket and drip steadily from the brim of the cheap baseball cap someone had loaned him from the lost and found bin. Every fiber of his old self, the hotel manager who never so much as wrinkled a cuff, rebelled against the discomfort. but he gritted his teeth and waited. When the truck finally lurched to a halt, the driver, a burly man with an easy smile, hopped down and waved. "Food bank special today," he said, thumbing toward the rattling cargo bay. "Good luck, buddy." Inside were pallets piled high with dented cans, wilted vegetables, and crates of bread so stale it could have been used as building material. Elliot climbed into the truck, his sneakers squelching on the wet metal floor, and began unloading. No one else was available to help. Most of the volunteers were busy inside, preparing the lunch service for the growing line of people stretching around the block. Marianne was overseeing the intake forms, a task Elliot had learned was far more complicated and emotionally taxing than it appeared. So he worked alone, halfway through the third pallet. As he bent to lift another crate, Elliot's foot slipped on the wet floor. He went down hard, landing awkwardly on his side, the edge of the crate jamming painfully into his ribs. For a few stunned seconds, he simply lay there, the rain slashing down around him, breath knocked from his body, the sharp metallic taste of humiliation filling his mouth. He wanted, desperately, to curse, to punch the crate, to walk away and leave the rest of the delivery to rot in the rain. But there was no one else coming. No cavalry, no polished staff waiting to swoop in and save him. Slowly, grimacing, he pushed himself upright. His jacket was torn at the elbow. His jeans, already battered, were ripped across the knee. Somewhere deep inside, the voice of the man he had once been whispered, "You don't belong here. You're not one of them." But another voice, quieter but infinitely stronger, answered back, "You're exactly where you need to be." Elliot gathered the spilled cans, one by one, his fingers numb with cold, and finished unloading the truck. When he finally staggered back into the community center, drenched and shivering, he found Marianne waiting near the door with a towel. She said nothing, just handed it to him and turned back toward the main hall, where the noise of lunchtime chatter filled the air. Elliot wiped himself off as best he could, then tucked the towel under his arm and followed her. The hall was packed. Folding tables sagged under the weight of food trays, and every chair was filled. Children wove between the adults, laughter and cries rising in equal measure. Volunteers darted back and forth, refilling trays, handing out bottled water, offering smiles that asked for nothing in return. In the far corner, Elliot saw Mrs. Chapman, the elderly woman who reminded him so painfully of his own grandmother, picking delicately at a plate of overcooked pasta. A young boy, probably no more than 6, sat beside her, kicking his heels rhythmically against the chair leg, his shirt 2 sizes too big and stained at the cuffs. Without thinking, Elliot crossed the room and crouched beside them. "Hi," he said, forcing a smile that felt raw around the edges. "Is there anything you need?" Mrs. Chapman looked up, her cloudy eyes sharp with intelligence despite her frailty. "Got any more bread, young man?" she asked, tapping her plate with a crooked finger. "I'll get you some," Elliot promised. He started to rise, but the boy tugged at his sleeve. "Hey, mister," the boy said, voice high and serious. "You're all wet." Elliot laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Yeah," he admitted. "Bad day for deliveries." The boy considered this gravely, then nodded, as if acknowledging the solemn truth of it. By the time Elliot returned with 2 extra bread rolls, the boy had launched into an enthusiastic monologue about dinosaurs, and Mrs. Chapman was smiling quietly into her tea. Elliot placed the bread carefully on the table, then sat down across from them, listening as the boy explained the fierce majesty of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. For a few moments, everything else, the rain, the bruised ribs, the ruined clothes, faded into the background. Here, at this battered table under flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by people who had been invisible to him for most of his life, Elliot found something he had never once glimpsed in all his years behind the concierge desk. A genuine connection. No pretenses, no appearances to maintain, just people, broken and beautiful, surviving together. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. He scrubbed dishes until his fingers pruned, organized the dry goods closet into something resembling order, and helped haul trash bags heavier than anything he had ever lifted in the pristine world of the Grand Meridian. By the time the center finally closed its doors for the night, Elliot was beyond exhausted. Every muscle screamed. His hands were raw. His stomach growled in protest. But deeper still, there was another ache. One that had nothing to do with physical pain. Guilt. Not just for how he had treated Marianne Lawrence that day in the lobby, but for all the unseen slights, the small dismissals, the careless cruelties he had allowed endorsed over the years without even realizing it. He thought about the families who had been turned away from the Grand Meridian because they didn't look the part. About the woman who had once asked, in a timid voice, if there was a discount for military spouses and how he had brushed her off because her coat was threadbare. Each memory struck like a blow to the gut. The old Elliot Winchester had believed in standards. The new Elliot Winchester was beginning to understand something much more difficult. Much more necessary. Standards without humanity were worthless. Later, as he sat slumped on the curb outside the center, the rain finally easing into a mist, Marianne approached and handed him a steaming cup of coffee from the diner down the street. "You made it through the worst day," she said. Sitting down beside him without asking, he wrapped his hands around the cup, grateful for the heat. "Was it the worst?" he asked. Voice hoarse, she smiled faintly. "No, but it felt like it when I started, too." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the mist curl through the cracked pavement. Finally, Elliot spoke, his voice so low it was almost lost in the night. "I don't know if I can fix what I did." Marianne didn't answer right away. She simply sipped her coffee, letting the silence stretch until it felt safe. "You can't," she said eventually. "Not all of it. Some things you just have to carry." He nodded, a slow, painful acknowledgement. "But you can decide what you build next," she added, "what you stand for now." And there, under the misty remnants of the rain, Elliot Winchester made a choice, not a grand, sweeping vow, not a dramatic speech, just a simple, quiet promise to himself to see, to serve, to never again mistake appearance for worth. He lifted the coffee cup in a silent toast to the battered city around him, to the broken people who had taught him how to be whole. And for the first time in a long while, Elliot felt something bloom quietly in his chest. Hope. The next morning dawned in a haze of gray mist and aching limbs. Elliot Winchester stood at the mirror of the tiny staff bathroom at the community center, examining the dark circles under his eyes, the smear of grime along his collar, the faint bruising still purpling along his ribs where he'd fallen in the rain. The man staring back at him looked older, more worn but somehow also more solid, as if the chisel of exhaustion had carved away the brittle facade he'd once worn like armor. He splashed water on his face, patted it dry with a thin paper towel, and forced himself to straighten. Today mattered. He didn't know how. He knew only that Marianne Lawrence had asked him to stay behind after closing hours. No explanation. Just a brief, unreadable glance across the lunch tables and a quiet, "I'd like to speak with you later, if you have time." He had time. He would make time. The day unfolded like all the others, hours of lifting, serving, cleaning, hundreds of small, necessary tasks performed without thanks or expectation. Yet there was a new steadiness in Elliot's movements now, a quiet focus that had replaced the frantic need to prove himself. He didn't look for praise. He didn't flinch when someone barked an order or forgot to say thank you. He just worked. When the last chair was stacked and the kitchen lights dimmed, Elliot found Marianne waiting by the battered office door with 2 mugs of cheap coffee and a file folder tucked under her arm. She handed him a mug, motioned toward the threadbare couch against the far wall, and sat down opposite him, balancing the file on her lap. "I've been watching you," she said without preamble. Elliot sipped the scalding coffee, wincing slightly but saying nothing. "At first," she continued, "I thought you were just trying to get through your time here. Punch your card. Serve your sentence." Elliot opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand, silencing him. But then I saw something change, she said. You stopped looking for the exit. You started seeing the people right in front of you. He exhaled slowly, feeling both exposed and strangely relieved. I didn't know how blind I was, he admitted. Marianne studied him for a long moment, then set the coffee aside and opened the file. Inside were glossy sheets, event plans, photographs of gala tables, handwritten notes in neat, looping script. The community center's been struggling, she said. Funding's down. Donations are dropping. We're barely keeping the lights on. Elliot leaned forward instinctively, scanning the pages. I didn't realize, he murmured. Most people don't, Marianne said simply. But you know how to run events. You know how to organize chaos into something beautiful. He looked up, startled. You want me to? I want you to plan our annual fundraiser, she said, her voice steady. It's 2 months from now. It's our biggest event of the year, and this time, it's not about impressing CEOs or politicians. It's about saving this place. The magnitude of what she was asking hit him like a wave. Plan a fundraiser here for these people who had unknowingly rebuilt him piece by piece after everything he had been, everything he had done. I don't know if I'm the right person, he said, his voice rough. Marianne's eyes didn't waver. I think you are, she said, and more importantly, I think you can be. He sat back, letting the weight of the decision settle into him. Could he do it? Could he take everything he had learned in the polished, ruthless world of luxury hospitality and wield it in service of something real, something messy and honest? Could he build something that mattered? I'll need help, he said finally. Marianne's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile. You'll have it. Over the following weeks, Elliot threw himself into the work with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed. The community center became his second home, its flickering lights and peeling paint, as familiar to him now as the crystal chandeliers and marble floors of his old life. He pored over budgets late into the night, drafted sponsorship proposals with the single battered laptop the center kept for admin work, and hounded every contact he could still salvage from his previous career. Most of them, predictably, didn't return his calls. Some did cautiously, curiously, intrigued by the novelty of it, the former Grand Meridian manager slumming it for charity. He didn't care why they came, only that they did. He worked with Marianne and Mrs. Davis in a small army of volunteers to transform the neglected courtyard behind the center into an event space, borrowing fairy lights from local businesses, scraping together mismatched chairs, sewing banners by hand late into the night. There were setbacks, of course. A freak storm ruined their first set of outdoor tables. A local sponsor pulled out at the last minute. One of the key volunteer coordinators had to quit when her son fell ill. Each time, Elliot felt the old frustration surge, but he fought it down, adapted, adjusted, learned, and in the process, something inside him hardened not into the brittle shell he had once worn, but into something stronger, more flexible. He became not just a manager, but a part of the community he had once looked down upon. On the eve of the fundraiser, Elliot stood in the middle of the transformed courtyard, surveying the twinkling lights, the tables set with mismatched but lovingly polished silverware, the hand-painted signs welcoming guests. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't the Grand Meridian, but it was beautiful in a way no five-star hotel had ever been. You did good, Marianne said beside him, her voice warm. Elliot shook his head, a small smile tugging at his mouth. We did, he corrected. The first guests began to trickle in, families from the neighborhood, local business owners, a few cautious donors in suits looking slightly out of place among the laughter and music. Elliot moved through the crowd with a grace born not of polished etiquette, but of genuine connection. He shook hands, he listened, he welcomed. As twilight deepened into night, Franklin Lawrence himself arrived, Marianne at his side. The buzz that followed their entrance was palpable, but Franklin brushed aside the formal greetings, heading straight for Elliot. You look good, Winchester, he said, Offering his hand, Elliot shook it firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. Franklin surveyed the courtyard, the glowing lights, the joyful chaos. "You built this," he said, almost to himself. "No, Elliot said, glancing around at the volunteers, the families, the faces he now knew by heart. "They did. I just helped them believe they could." Franklin nodded once, approval evident in the set of his mouth. As the evening wore on, Elliot found a quiet moment to step back and simply watch. Children ran laughing between the tables. Old women danced awkwardly to a crackling speaker playing Motown hit. Men who had once stood in food lines now stood tall, toasting one another with plastic cups of lemonade. It wasn't perfect. It was better. Marianne appeared at his side, her arms folded, her face shining with pride. "You're not who you were when you walked into the Grand Meridian," she said softly. "No," Elliot agreed, "and I don't ever want to be again." She smiled, bumping her shoulder lightly against his. "Good," she said, "because the world needs more men like the one you're becoming." And for the first time, not just in these last few brutal, beautiful weeks, but perhaps for the first time in his life, Elliot Winchester believed it. Not because someone told him, not because of a title or a paycheck or a pristine lobby bearing his mark, but because, at last, he had found something worth building. A life of service, a heart of integrity. A legacy not carved into marble or etched in gold, but written in the grateful smiles and shining eyes of people who mattered, people he finally, truly saw. The night after the fundraiser ended in a slow, golden unraveling of music and laughter. Elliot Winchester stayed behind with the last of the volunteers, folding chairs and stacking empty trays under the soft canopy of string lights. His hands were blistered, his back ached, but his heart was lighter than it had been in years. The success of the evening was undeniable. They had raised nearly double the amount projected, enough to keep the center's programs running for another year, maybe even expand a few of them if they were careful. Still, Elliot found himself lingering after the others had gone, walking alone among the deserted tables, the air rich with the smell of trampled grass and sweet lemonade. A forgotten balloon, half deflated, bumped against the leg of a folding chair in the breeze. He stooped, tied it off properly, and smiled to himself. It wasn't just the money, it wasn't the numbers on a spreadsheet, it was what he had seen in the faces of the people who had come, the pride, the hope, the sense of belonging. It was real, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Elliot felt like he was part of something that mattered, anything that wouldn't just vanish when the lights went off or the event ended. The next morning, back at the Grand Meridian, the contrast was almost surreal. The hotel was preparing for a major political summit, and the tension in the air was electric. Staff buzzed like bees in a hive, crisp uniforms flashing under chandeliers, polished shoes tapping an urgent rhythm on marble floors. Every corner of the lobby gleamed, every flower arrangement was precisely aligned. Everything was exactly as Elliot had once worshipped it to be. And yet, walking through those familiar halls now, he felt a strange sense of distance, as if he were passing through a museum dedicated to a life he no longer inhabited. He had only returned because his official suspension was ending. Marcus Bennett had called him into a private meeting, careful and formal over the phone, as if speaking to someone newly minted, uncertain whether to embrace or exile. Elliot straightened his tie in the mirror of the executive office bathroom, a reflex so ingrained he barely thought about it, and then paused. The tie felt wrong, tight, foreign. He loosened it slightly, allowing himself to breathe, and went to face whatever waited. Marcus's office was as sterile and immaculate as ever leather chairs, dark wood, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Marcus himself rose when Elliot entered, extending a hand. "Winchester," he said, a professional smile flickering across his face. "Please, sit." Elliot shook the hand, noting the slight stiffness in Marcus's posture, the cautious measuring in his eyes. as if he couldn't quite decide whether Elliot was a liability or a redemption story. Marcus cleared his throat, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "I've reviewed the reports from the community center," he said. "I've spoken with Mrs. Lawrence, with Mr. Lawrence, with several guests who attended the fundraiser." Elliot waited, silent. Marcus leaned back slightly, tapping a pen against the edge of a portfolio. "By all accounts," he continued, "you performed admirably, exceeded expectations. Even." Elliot inclined his head slightly but said nothing. "But," Marcus said, and the word hung heavily between them, "the board is concerned." Of course they were. The Grand Meridian's board had built their empire and perceptions on glittering facades, impeccable reputations. Marcus hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "They're willing to reinstate you," he said finally, "but in a new role." Elliot's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Community liaison," Marcus said, "managing charitable partnerships, overseeing public relations for our philanthropic efforts." It was a demotion. Technically, less prestige, less power, but it was also a bridge, a chance to use what he had learned, to carve a new path without abandoning the place he had once called home. And for the first time, Elliot didn't feel resentment rise in his chest at the idea. He felt relief. "I'll take it," he said simply. Marcus blinked, clearly having expected a negotiation, a protest, something. "Good," he said after a moment. "Good." They moved through the formalities quickly after that paperwork. New ID badges, scheduling introductions with the charity partners. As Elliot signed the final form, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "You know," he said, almost confidentially, "a lot of people wouldn't have come back after what happened." Elliot met his gaze steadily. "A lot of people," he said, "never really leave." Marcus frowned, puzzled, but Elliot offered no further explanation. He left the office lighter than he had entered. There was still so much work ahead, so many fractures to heal, so much trust to rebuild. But for the first time, Elliot Winchester felt equal to the task. The following days blurred into a rhythm both new and familiar. He met with local nonprofit leaders, organized charity brunches in the hotel ballroom, set up partnerships with food banks and shelters. He spent less time behind polished desks and more time out in the city, real places, real people. He sat on cracked sidewalks handing out bottled water during a heat wave. He spent afternoons reading to kids in overfilled shelters. He stood in food pantry lines handing out canned goods, nodding respectfully to veterans and single mothers and teenagers too weary for their years. Each encounter etched deeper into him the simple truth that Marianne had taught without ever once preaching. People were not problems to be managed. They were lives to be honored. One evening, late, as he returned to the hotel after a long day, Elliot found himself pausing in the grand lobby, watching the guests sweep through in their glittering gowns and tailored suits. He remembered a time, not so long ago, when he would have judged each one in an instant, categorized them, measured their value by their clothes, their posture, their accents. Now, he saw only people. Some would be kind, some would be cruel, some would be lonely, others desperate to be seen, all of them human, across the marble expanse. He spotted Marianne Lawrence seated in one of the armchairs, a thick folder open on her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, her blonde hair pinned back loosely, no jewels, no flashing labels, just grace. He crossed the floor toward her, weaving through the shifting tides of guests, and she looked up with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Good day," she asked. "The best," he said. She rose, gathering her papers, and together they walked toward the elevators. Neither of them spoke as the elevator doors slid shut and the city fell away beneath them. Words weren't necessary. They had both seen what mattered. They had both chosen. When the elevator opened onto the rooftop terrace, a place Elliot hadn't visited in months, he followed Marianne out into the crisp evening air. The city stretched below them, a living, breathing tapestry of lights and motion and infinite stories. Marianne leaned against the railing, gazing out at the horizon. "You know," she said softly, "it's easy to believe change is impossible, that people can't or won't be better." Elliot stepped up beside her, resting his hands on the cool iron rail. "But sometimes," she continued, "you meet someone who reminds you why you keep trying anyway." He turned his head, meeting her steady gaze. "Thank you," he said. The words simple but thick with meaning. She smiled a small, private smile and turned back toward the city. In the hush that followed, as the stars blinked to life overhead, Elliot Winchester understood redemption wasn't something you earned once and carried forever like a medal. It was something you chose, every day, in small, invisible ways, in the moments no one else saw. And tonight, like every night now, he chose it again. In the weeks that followed, Elliot Winchester built a new rhythm at the Grand Meridian, not from habit or ambition, but from something deeper, sturdier. He was no longer just a cog in the grand machinery of luxury. He was something quieter, something more enduring, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed to him hopelessly divided. Charity partnerships flourished under his watch. A once empty wing of the hotel became a permanent donation site for local shelters. Corporate clients who once measured prestige in caviar and gold leaf now found themselves quietly investing in community programs. And to Elliot's surprise, many of them were eager, relieved even, to have a way to make their wealth matter. Every Friday, he still returned to Jefferson Community Center, not out of obligation but because it anchored him, reminded him where real worth lived. He peeled potatoes, mopped floors, played checkers badly with the kids after homework hours. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive by the standards he had once lived by. It was necessary. It was right. Late one afternoon, while finalizing preparations for a new initiative, a holiday gala that would funnel proceeds to a network of struggling food banks, Elliot received an unexpected visitor. He was sorting through vendor contracts in a small side office when Mrs. Davis appeared, knocking lightly on the doorframe. "You have a visitor," she said, her smile a little too carefully neutral. Elliot frowned, setting aside the papers. "Who is it?" "Someone from your past," she said simply, stepping aside, and there, framed in the hallway light, stood Richard Vaughn, Elliot's former boss, the man who had once mentored him with sharp precision and even sharper expectations, the embodiment of the old world Elliot had left behind. Richard looked almost exactly as Elliot remembered: the impeccable gray suit, the polished shoes, the wristwatch worth more than most people's cars. His expression, however, was unfamiliar, a tight, assessing look that made Elliot's shoulders tense without meaning to. "Elliot," Richard said, stepping forward with a hand extended, slowly. Elliot shook it. "Richard," he said, his voice steady. Richard glanced around the modest office, his mouth twitching slightly at the peeling paint and budget furniture. "I heard about your new position," he said carefully. "It's caused quite a stir in certain circles." Elliot smiled thinly. "I imagine it has." Richard's gaze sharpened. "You were one of the best we had," he said. "Precise, disciplined. You understood the clientele, the image we needed to project." "I understood how to pretend," Elliot said quietly. Richard's mouth tightened. "You could have gone far. Winchester, higher than Grand Meridian. I had plans for you." The old part of Elliot, the part still wired for ambition and approval, stirred faintly at the words, but he pushed it down. "I had plans, too," he said. "They just changed." Richard studied him for a long moment. "You're wasting your talents here," he said eventually. "Charity work, community liaisons, it's admirable, but it's small, limited. You're capable of so much more." Elliot said nothing, letting the words fall between them like brittle leaves. Finally, Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick cream envelope, placing it carefully on the desk. "A proposal," he said, "an offer to come back, not to the Meridian, bigger, better, a new property, opening in Dubai, executive director, corner office, Blank check to build your team. Elliot stared at the envelope as if it might bite. He knew the old him would have ripped it open before Richard even finished speaking. He also knew the new him needed to breathe before even touching it. "I'll let you think about it," Richard said, turning toward the door. He paused, glancing back. "Don't waste yourself, Elliot," he said softly. "Not when you have the chance to be extraordinary." And then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of expensive cologne and the heavy envelope sitting accusingly on the desk. Elliot sat down slowly. The office suddenly felt too small, too quiet. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the envelope. Executive Director, a life of first-class flights, international power, blank checks, the dream he had once bled for, the dream he had given up without even knowing he was doing it. He didn't open it. Instead, he picked up his jacket, shoved the envelope into the bottom drawer, and walked out into the late afternoon light. The lobby was buzzing with the preparations for the holiday gala. Staff bustled with decorations, catering crews wheeled in carts stacked with trays of appetizers, and the musicians were setting up on the small stage near the grand piano. And at the heart of it all, standing on a ladder stringing fairy lights across the main archway, was Marianne Lawrence. She wore jeans and a simple white sweater, her hair tied back in a loose braid. She laughed as one of the young volunteers, Jordan, the little boy from the shelter, handed her another strand of lights with solemn ceremony. Something in Elliot's chest tightened painfully. He crossed the lobby toward them, instinct guiding his steps. "Need a hand," he called up. Marianne grinned down at him. "Only if you're willing to risk your life climbing a very shaky ladder." He chuckled. "I think I'll hold it steady and let you take the glory." Matting together. They finished the lights, Jordan clapping enthusiastically when the last bulb blinked on, casting the lobby in a soft, warm glow. Later, after the gala was underway, Elliot found a quiet moment on the mezzanine balcony, watching the scene unfold below. Guests mingled and laughed, their donations already pouring into the silent auction tables. Children darted between the adults, clutching paper snowflakes they had made in the craft corner. It wasn't flawless. A few guests looked confused when served on paper plates instead of fine china. Some donors fumbled awkwardly when approached by kids eager to share handmade ornaments. But there was joy here, authentic, sprawling, messy joy. And Elliot realized, standing there in the golden light of the Grand Meridian, transformed by kindness instead of perfection, that he already had everything Richard's offer promised and more. He had meaning. He had belonging. He had pride, not built on appearances, but on actions. He didn't need a corner office. He needed this. He needed them. When the gala finally wound down, when the last tray was cleared and the last child tucked into a sleeping parent's arms, Marianne found him still standing quietly near the now darkened stage. "You okay?" she asked, nudging his arm lightly. He nodded slowly. "Richard Vaughn came by earlier," he said, voice low. Marianne raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he offered me a job. Dubai, executive director. Big salary, big future." "And," she asked, her voice steady, "I didn't open the envelope." Elliot said, "I didn't need to." She smiled, a slow, proud smile that reached her eyes. "You found your real work." She said, "I found my real home." Elliot corrected gently. They stood there in the quiet, the echoes of laughter still lingering in the rafters, the scent of pine and candle wax and hope heavy in the air. And somewhere beyond the glittering walls of the Grand Meridian, the city stretched out broken and beautiful and worth every ounce of effort it demanded. Elliot Winchester straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of the future settle around him, not as a burden, but as a calling. He was ready, truly, finally ready. The morning after the gala, the Grand Meridian was quieter than usual. Sunlight spilled through the towering windows, painting the marble floors in bands of gold and shadow. The cleanup was already underway, crews folding linens, sweeping confetti from the corners, dismantling the last of the handmade decorations. But there was a hush in the air, a kind of reverent fatigue. Elliot Winchester stood near the concierge desk, a clipboard tucked under his arm, surveying the scene. His muscles ached from too little sleep and too much hauling, but beneath the exhaustion, there was a deep, abiding peace. The numbers from the gala were better than anyone had dared hope. Enough funds had been raised not just to support Jefferson Community Center, but to expand its program's literacy classes, after-school care, job training. Dreams that had once felt laughable in their ambition were now tangible possibilities. He hadn't done it alone. That was the lesson he carried most heavily in his heart. None of it, not the fundraiser, not the partnerships, not the community being woven thread by thread back into something strong, had been a solo achievement. It had been built together by hands that the old Elliot would never have thought to see, much less trust. He smiled to himself and made a note to send thank you letters to every single volunteer. Mrs. Davis approached, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her smile crinkling at the edges. Another donor, Elliot guessed, already mentally scanning his calendar for available time slots. Mrs. Davis shook her head. "No, someone else." He turned and froze, standing just inside the lobby doors, looking both wildly out of place and exactly right. Was Miguel, who had once limped through the food pantry line with shame burning on his cheek. Miguel, who had spent every spare hour in the community center kitchen, learning, helping, building. Today, he wore a crisp white shirt tucked neatly into dark jeans. In his hands, he held a small package wrapped carefully in brown paper. Elliot crossed the lobby swiftly. "Miguel," he said, genuinely smiling. "What are you doing here?" Miguel shifted awkwardly, his hand tightening around the package. "I heard about the gala," he said, "and Mrs. Lawrence said you helped make it happen." Elliot shrugged, feeling heat rise to his face. "It was a team effort." Miguel nodded, then held out the package. "I made something," he said. "Wanted to say thank you." Elliot took the package carefully, unwrapping the paper to reveal a wooden plaque, hand-carved, the letters uneven but unmistakable. A bridge, not a wall. The words hit Elliot harder than he could have anticipated. He blinked rapidly, running his fingers over the rough grooves, the imperfect beauty of it. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. Miguel ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "You showed us," he said simply, "that we mattered." Elliot swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "You showed me the same," he said. Miguel grinned, the awkwardness melting away into something open and bright. As Miguel turned to leave, heading back into the city with a spring in his step that hadn't been there before, Elliot stood holding the plaque like it was made of gold. Across the lobby, Marianne Lawrence watched him with quiet satisfaction. Later that afternoon, after the last of the cleanup was done and the hotel had returned to its usual glittering facade, Franklin Lawrence arrived for a scheduled meeting in the presidential suite. Elliot met him at the elevator, nerves prickling despite himself. Franklin shook his hand firmly, smiling. "Good to see you, Winchester." "You too, sir." They moved through the suite past the panoramic views, the gleaming woodwork, the understated opulence until they reached the sitting area where Marianne was already waiting with a folder open on the coffee table. "First order of business," Franklin said, settling into a chair. "The foundation is expanding. We're creating a permanent liaison position between the Grand Meridian and the community organizations you've been working with." He fixed Elliot with a steady gaze. "And we'd like you to head it." Elliot blinked. I'm honored," he said, genuinely stunned. Franklin chuckled. "Don't be. You earned it." Marianne leaned forward, her voice gentler. "You understand what's at stake now," she said. "You know what it means to build something that lasts." Elliot nodded, overwhelmed by a fierce, almost painful gratitude. "I won't let you down," he said. "We know," Franklin said simply. They spent the next hour drafting preliminary outlines, mapping strategies, setting goals. But even as the professional framework unfolded around him, Elliot knew the real work would happen far from these polished walls and the battered classrooms, the crowded shelters, the tiny kitchens where hope simmered alongside soup pot. That night, after the meetings ended, Elliot found himself once again wandering through the nearly deserted lobby. Outside, the city pulsed and breathed, its neon arteries winding through darkness. Inside, the Grand Meridian glowed softly, a beacon of what it could become, not just a monument to wealth, but a crossroads where compassion and privilege could meet. He paused near the entrance, his reflection faint in the glass doors. The man staring back at him was different now. Older, yes, wearier, certainly, but also stronger, surer, more real. As he turned to go, he noticed a small boy standing near the concierge desk, looking lost, clutching a battered backpack. Without hesitation, Elliot crossed the marble floor. "Hey there," he said, crouching to the boy's level. "Are you okay?" The boy nodded, but his lip trembled. "My mom's parking the car," he said. "She told me to wait, but it's been a long time." Elliot smiled gently. "Why don't we wait together?" he offered. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded. They sat together on the velvet bench near the entrance, watching the comings and goings of a world too big and too fast. Minutes later, a frantic woman burst through the doors, scanning the lobby desperately. "Jacob!" she cried. The boy leapt up and ran to her, and she swept him into her arms, murmuring reassurances. As they left, the woman glanced back at Elliot, mouthing a silent thank you. Elliot nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. No applause, no medals, just the simple, unremarkable act of seeing someone, being there when it mattered. And that, he knew now, was enough. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the city stretching endlessly before him, Elliot Winchester walked forward without hesitation, without fear. He had chosen his path, not the glittering promise of power, not the empty pursuit of perfection, but the messy, magnificent work of building bridges. And somewhere deep inside, a voice steady and certain whispered, "This is what extraordinary really looks like." And he believed it. At last, he believed it.